This is prairie ecology here. It's a mixed grass prairie, and I have to go for a walk on the prairie every few days because it really restores me. You know, the grasses and the wind and the wetlands, and all of that is here as a gift from the soil. I think that there's an important, and I'm going to use the word ministry here, there's an important ministry to farmers, because farmers, for the most part, the message which they get is that it is their fault if they aren't succeeding. So picture this. There's a middle-aged farmer, probably in his mid-40s. The farm that he is on now with his family has been in that family for maybe 3 or 4 generations. And now it's his turn, and it's his responsibility. And he has the mandate to pass that farm on to the next generation. But he's in this difficult place where the market does not reward him for what he's doing. And he, for the first time in that long generation of that family, has to face the fact that he's the one that's going to lose it. And there isn't anybody there that's really saying, wait a minute, you know, it really isn't your fault. If farmers at that point decide that they will quit and sell to pay off their debts, very often they find that their assets, while it may cover their debts, will not pay for the income tax bill that they have, because they have to pay income tax on the assets which they sell. And that's where many of the suicides come, you know, when farmers recognize that not only can't they continue farming, they can't even quit. And particularly if they have life insurance, they figure that this is a way that, you know, their families at least can cope and can go on. So the suicide rates have been going up dramatically over the last decade.
We have seen a steady erosion of the farms, and every year people are told how many thousands of farms have been pushed out, but it is not because of competition. This is a very direct consequence of a deliberate policy geared towards supporting what was called in the 70s a get big or get out policy. The irony is that as small farmers are replaced by larger farms and more quantities of food are grown, in fact, hunger increases, especially among those who were formerly food producers. And the trade agreements are a big part of this. The argument has been that everyone will rise with the trade policies that countries are now required to put into place. Everyone has been told that consumers everywhere and farmers and countries rich and countries poor will all benefit. And in fact, the opposite has happened. Instead of everybody rising with the tide, people are drowning.
You can go all around the world. The vast majority of countries have a very large decline in the rate of growth of income per person. For example, in Latin America, income per person, which is the most basic measure of economic welfare, income per person grew by 75% from 1960 to 1980. And since 1980, the last 20 years, it's grown by about 7%, hardly at all. In Africa, you have about 34% growth from 1960 to 1980 and a decline of at least 15% over the last, an actual decline in income per person over the last 20 years. Our most recent study, we found progress in life expectancy, literacy, infant mortality, adult mortality, and child mortality, education. All of those social indicators for which there are data, all of that has shown much slower progress over the last 20 years than it did in the previous 20 years. And that's partly because this whole experiment in extremist globalization has really failed.
You see big cities like Delhi and Bombay full of people who are migrating from the countryside because we cannot feed ourselves. Almost 2 million small family farmers are being driven off the land. Many of us have heard about Indian farmers drinking pesticides in sheer frustration and committing suicides because they cannot feed their families. So you have a model of a country which was making progress since independence, trying to provide the basic human right to food, to decent standard of living to all its people, and that model has been shattered by this free market prescription which has come from countries like the United States. We are not against trade. In fact, trade has always existed. What we are saying is we are against trade at any cost.
We hear a lot about the free market and its ability to solve social problems as well as to create universal prosperity. I'm a great advocate of the market. I think the market is a terribly powerful institutional instrument if used properly. But it's also understood there are certain things that markets don't do. They do not create equity. They do not respond to social needs of people who do not have money. I mean, that's a reality of the market. It responds to money. So if you get a society as we have now, particularly a global society, in which a majority of the people have very, very little, if any, money, you know, roughly 40% of the world's population that lives on $2 a day or less, the market system simply does not respond.
Countries are forced to open their borders to an influx of products from abroad. And as long as we have that kind of free trade policy, it's very difficult to imagine a way to end hunger. What free trade does is it allows large companies to dominate the markets of local countries, to undercut local farmers, and to destroy the ability of countries to feed themselves in the future. And that really perpetuates and deepens the structures that promote hunger. I think if we're going to seriously deal with hunger, we have to say countries need the ability to design policies that are in accordance with their own needs. We have to take a step back from extremist free trade policies. And if that means protecting basic food production, then so be it.
Any government that wants to pursue an agricultural policy that puts the nutritional interests and the economic interests of small farmers first, they will immediately run into opposition from the IMF and the World Bank, who truly believe that it's more efficient to invade all markets from the largest producers in the world. The argument that the IMF and the bank would make is a simple textbook economics argument about comparative advantage. And from their argument, if you can't produce rice or corn or any other grain as cheaply as the cheapest producer in the world, then you shouldn't be producing that. You should be producing something else and importing that food. And they don't take into account things like, first of all, that these grains are heavily subsidized by some of the large producers like the United States. And secondly, that countries have other interests in food security or land reform or other key agricultural policies that have to do with developing their own economy and keeping people fed.
There is a tremendous amount of pressure to eliminate all of those people who are growing food for themselves and their villages, their communities. And all of that food production capacity, that land, is being concentrated and controlled by some of the biggest corporate players in the world, establishing the prices and the profits that they garner. The price you pay for most of the food you buy on the shelf is almost completely unrelated to the price that we as farmers get for the real nutritious part in the food. As we get lower and lower prices, you're paying higher and higher prices, and all of that profit margin is being garnered in between there by the the owners of that industrial processing part of the food system, because they control the chemical price, the fertilizer price, the fuel prices, the machinery prices. And when I say they, I'm talking about a handful of corporations, many of the names you would recognize. And those are the people that are doing very well in the food system.
Over the last 3 decades or so, we've had a tremendous consolidation of the global food system in which we've seen mergers, leveraged buyouts, fewer and fewer companies have come to control each step along that food system or that food chain. For example, Philip Morris, a tobacco company, after acquiring Nabisco, is very likely now the world's second largest food corporation after Nestle.
The combination of Kraft and Nabisco creates a real global leader in the food industry. Scale is a real advantage in this industry. As Kraft has proven, it increases both efficiency and effectiveness leverages our service to the trade, and benefits.
It hasn't made an enormous difference. I mean, food was probably 31% of our revenues. It's now going to be 35% of our revenues. Beer's about 4%, tobacco's 60%. But if you look at the international tobacco opportunities, we have about 16, 17 market share points of the world. So there still remains considerable opportunity out there for us, and we plan to take advantage of it.
We have companies like Archer Daniels Midland and Cargill that together control almost the entire grain trade in the world, and they unilaterally set the price, and they set that price low. Large corporate farms stay in business because they're getting these huge subsidy payments. Small family farmers can't stay in business because they don't have enough acres to get a significant subsidy payment. The subsidy is paid per acre, and because the prices are below the cost of production, they can't survive on what they sell either. So U.S. grain goes abroad, and it's placed in a local economy at prices that are so low that local farmers can't compete. We have small corn farmers in Mexico. They have provided the basic staple food for the entire population of the Mexican nation. They cannot do that if cheap American corn is dumped into the Mexican economy through NAFTA and through these U.S. policies at prices below the cost of production. So they're driven off the land. In desperation, they may move to cities, they may move to the United States, or they may even rise up in arms. Thus, we have the Zapatista rebellion in southern Mexico, in Chiapas.
So you have this tremendous struggle in many parts of the world for access to land, access to productive land, and that's a particular struggle for women who want access to that land, not so they can produce crops for export and hard cash, but who want access to that land so that they can grow food to feed themselves and their children. And the corporate interests of the world can't see any profitability there. And they're right. This is about feeding people. It matters whether you're on a rocky hillside or in a fertile valley, whether you can then grow enough food to feed your children and your village and bring food to the marketplace. You have places like Honduras, for example, where I was a visitor among farmers and peasants who were struggling in very adverse conditions there on the hillside to grow beans for their own use.
Sí, la distribución de la tierra es mala debido a...
That's right. Land is not distributed fairly because land is controlled by the rich. We poor people, we're pushed to the hillsides.
Veamos que hoy parece que tiene más valor una vaca.
It seems like a cow is worth more than a woman. A stud bull is worth more than a man, and a calf more than a child, because they're eating from the good grazing land and a good level ground, while the poor, we are on the hillsides.
The fresh fruit and vegetables that most of us eat are picked by hands of farmers who have been displaced from their own land and are now very low-wage farm workers.
Uno se siente triste, como abandonado, ¿verdad?
You feel very sad, like you have been abandoned. There's no one for you to turn to. Everything comes for you hard. Because, first of all, we don't have any money. We can't even go to the grocery store.
El hondureño está ganando $2.
In Honduras, you're earning $2 a day. And if you have 8 children and 2 adults, it can be hard to survive. So all the young people do is look towards the United States.
These are people who swell the ranks of the hungry, and they were owner-operators of their own small farms, which they cannot farm because of the drop in food prices as a result of what's come to be known as globalization.
There are really two very different dimensions to globalization, one of which most of us consider to be very positive, and the other which is sparking the protests and the reaction. The positive part is the opening up of global communication and exchange between people, recognizing that we live on one planet, Earth, that we must share and that we must learn to protect the natural systems of the Earth. The other dimension of globalization is how it leads to a loss of democracy as we open up the borders of nations to the expansion of corporations, creating a system of economic rule and economic institutions that are solely engaged in the creation of profits for their shareholders.
Well, right now the fast food market on the western side is around $300 million in sales. The fast food side on the Chinese side is around $3 billion in sales.
The global market is organized in such a way that only the big players survive, and the biggest players who control the market set the price, and they set the price for the raw product low enough that you can't make a living on your own small place. A low price is always an argument that people want to use to say, well, we can feed more people if food is cheaper. More people will eat. Ironically, that's not how it seems to be working. There's lots of data by now from around the world that plentiful, cheap supply of food is in fact inaccessible to people unless they too are part of a money economy. It doesn't matter to you that bread is only $1 a loaf if you're not making any dollars during the day.
When a large corporation comes forward and says, we want to feed the world, the statement is absurd on the face, because these corporations are only in the business of feeding people who have the money to buy their food. You get the roughly 1.2 billion people in the world who have an income of less than $1 a day. These people are not on the screen of the Monsantos and the Archer Daniels Midlands. They can't make any money selling food to them.
A very powerful myth that for many years American farmers believed was that they were feeding the world, and that all of the suffering of low prices and an impossible economic environment that the family farmer went through in the United States was justified because at least we were feeding the world. Well, it turns out that providing our food cheap to other countries destroys people's ability to feed themselves. It destroys nations' ability to feed themselves.
I think that many people in many different debates have sort of accepted this suggestion that corporate agriculture is necessary to feed the world, that there is scarcity out there, that there is hunger, and the only answer is bigger and bigger agriculture. First of all, scarcity is not the problem. There's enough food in the world right now to feed every woman, man, and child 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day. That's enough to get nice and fat on. Hunger is a symptom of poverty and inequality. And that's what we have to get to the root of if we're going to solve hunger. What we need to get back to is people being able to either feed themselves because they have access to land to do so, or people being able to feed themselves because they have sustainable livelihoods that allow them to purchase food for themselves and their families. That's the end to hunger, not more food production, particularly not the kind of food production we've got right now that's focused on maximum yield per acre, maximum short-term profit for a very small number of corporations.
Sometimes we're confused by the concept of yield. You may say that a 1,000-acre soybean farm produces more soybeans per acre than a 1-acre farm does. What that forgets is the 1,000-acre soybean farm, it's producing only soybeans. The 1-acre farm on that 1 acre is producing soybeans, corn, fruits, vegetables, tree crops, animal products, and when you add all of that together, you see the much greater productivity of the small farm. We've done very careful research at Food First for every country in the world, including the United States, for which data is available, comparing different farm sizes. We find that contrary to that myth, In fact, smaller farms, the world over, including in the United States, produce anywhere from 200 to 1,000% more total food per unit area than large mechanized industrial farms. Not only that, the kind of technology that the smaller farmer uses is much more sustainable. Small farmers conserve trees in the agricultural landscape. They do more soil conservation practices than large farmers. They're capable of using methods like organic and other kinds of alternative methods that don't contaminate the soil much more so than large farms. Essentially what we're doing is we're taking the most efficient, the most productive, and the most sustainable kind of farmers, the family farmer, and we're driving them out of business. And the most inefficient, unproductive, environmentally destructive, and socially destructive kind of farmers, the large corporate farmers, they're staying in business because the larger they get, the more subsidies they get.
If you're one of these large industrial farms, you will not be in a position to pay very much attention to how the land is cared for. The sole objective is going to be to produce as much as possible. And if that means the land is going to be destroyed in 10 or 15 years, it's not going to be much of a concern because the immediate goal is short-term profit, not long-term survivability. My father on this farm, his whole life was devoted to making sure that this farm was in good condition when it was passed on to me. I mean, that was his passion. He never cared about making money. He often said, I want to make enough money to keep the farm operating, but beyond that, it's not of concern to me. So that's a very different mindset about economics from the industrial corporate model. If you're going to farm in a way that takes care of the land, you have to be close enough to the land to know how to take care of it, because land is very different in different places. I learned how to farm here. I know this land. I know every square inch of it. I know what needs to be done to take care of it. I couldn't do it if it were a 50,000 acre farm because I couldn't be close enough to that much land in order to do it well. Farmers used to regard the soil almost as a sacred thing because they knew that that's where their food came from, and so they cared for it and had a relationship with it, which was, in every respect that we understand, a love relationship. We were lovers of the soil. Soil is a living thing. It's a living being. Soil scientists now tell us that there are over 2 billion species of microorganisms in a spoonful of soil.
I mean, you can't really see it with the naked eye, but this is filled with microorganic or microscopic organisms, and it smells good. And this is the only fertilizer that we use. And of course, it was produced by these animals. I have a farm that produces pork, lamb, chicken, eggs, vegetables, fruit, fish, beef, all the feeds that we feed to our animals. I absolutely love this place, and I love this work, and I love these animals, and I love these plants, and I love to get up in the morning and work 10 hours a day.
Sometimes I feel overwhelmed by how much there is to do, but on the other hand, the rewards of living here, you know, all the little life coming up. We have a lamb who should have died when she was born. She fit into Henning's hand, and we had to stomach tube her, and we were up for 24 hours with her, and we started feeding her round the clock every 3 hours. So at 4 o'clock in the morning, I'm out in that kitchen in that leather chair holding this little tiny lamb.
So this is Heidi.
Feeding her, and then the two of us would fall asleep out there.
This is the one lamb the shepherd goes out to find.
And growing plants is marvelous, too. These little guys have been growing from seed in our greenhouse for months, and they are like children. And it's enormously satisfying to feed our customers.
We sell the produce through a CSA, community-supported agriculture, at very low prices.
People pay an upfront amount at the beginning of the season, and then every week, all summer long and all winter long, too, we supply them with a week's worth of vegetables.
We feed about 25 people out of that garden. The bed space is only 2,000 square feet.
As someone who has never myself been hungry, I'm completely committed to the view that those who are well fed need to think long and hard about how hunger is actually created and then how we solve it. And it seems to me the tools we've reached for have in some ways been the tools of technology and of trade and of control over nature and control over others. What we need to do is revalue food and food production. And we have to stop this idea that what nature gives us is for free and hence deserves a low commodity price. And we have to start thinking that what nature gives us is the most precious and is in fact the key to our sustainable continued existence in the world.
La tierra es un don de Dios para cada cultura.
For every culture, land is a gift from God. Without it, I don't think there would be any life for me. I think it's the same for you, isn't it? Where could you build your house? Where could you grow food to survive? The sacred earth sustains us, doesn't it? Like a mother who nourishes her child with her breast, so Mother Earth provides for us when there is a good harvest, and there's a portion for us, and there's a portion for our animals. Without the land, life wouldn't exist, would it?
When we were recently in Seattle at the WTO, there was a tremendous amount of upset around the food system. And the question that everybody has to face now is, who is going to control it? Are we going to put the food we eat in the hands of millions and millions of small producers who have for thousands of years looked after the land and grown food? Or are we going to watch it being concentrated and controlled by fewer and fewer corporate players who are further and further away from the land, completely uninterested, for the most part, if you really look at it, in feeding the world, very interested in a high return on their investment?
It's no mistake that our food system has gone towards ever larger farms and fewer farmers on the land. It's not an accident and it's not inevitable. It's the direct result of about 4 decades of very deliberate government policy and investment. I would also say that it's not just food production alone that's driving small farmers off their land in the United States, off their land in the developing countries. It's also food consumption. The food, especially that we as Americans eat, has a tremendous impact on the world's environment and on the employment of people, millions of people throughout the world. When we walk into a grocery store and buy something, we don't think about who produced that, what kinds of working conditions they're subjected to, whether or not they were driven off their land and are now tenant farmers. We don't think about that. And I think we need to. I think we need to understand that our meat consumption is driving devastation of the rainforest and putting farmers out of business. The flip side is that our food choices can absolutely support a sustainable system that's good for everybody, that's good for the planet, that's good for local farmers, that's good for the economy. And that's where I think people need to be going, whether it's to community-supported agriculture, to farmers markets, to talking with their grocery manager about getting more regional, local food. I think all of those are options that people need to be looking at more and understanding how positive a change that can make.
If you take one
like this,
that won't hurt it. Get about 10 of those. That's just what you'll need. Delicious.
Conscious eating goes beyond food to support the rights of small farmers and really the rights of citizens everywhere to make their own decisions about not only what they're eating, but about their lives. Sovereign rights, the local decision-making control is really the heart of the issue in the future of the food system.
I think it would surprise a lot of North Americans to find out that about 65%, or in some estimates more, of the food that they eat has some ingredients in it that have been genetically modified. GMO products. You might want to know, because it's real intimate. I mean, it's going to be right inside you, literally. You might want to know. For consumers, you're being told that you will have better food in the long term. For example, the fish gene introduced into the tomato was supposed to give it a longer shelf life. What is it about the tomato that lasts such a long time with the fish gene in it that is so wonderful? And it's this. It's the possibility of moving foodstuffs, controlling foodstuffs and moving them for profitability into more and more places. I mean, the long-lasting shelf life is only of interest to you if you've got a long way to take that tomato and you need to store it for a long time. It's everything to do with profitability for corporations and very little to do with farmer profitability, with consumer well-being, or anything else. And it has nothing to do with environmental care. What we've done with genetically modified organisms is such a fundamental change that it's ludicrous to think that we have any real ideas of what the consequences will be. The risks are enormous. In terms of the food you eat, is it as safe as other food? We don't know. The corporate players that are doing the propaganda around this are very quick to say, look, it's biotechnology. We have done biotechnology forever. Why are you worried? This is just another tool.
When we talk about biotechnology, the part of it that's controversial is genetic engineering. Nobody's concerned about fermentation to produce yogurt or beer or a number of other things that might fall under the general term biotechnology. What's controversial is taking genes from one species and putting them into another where they would never be found in nature. These effects could be very environmentally dangerous. Imagine an insecticide gene moving out into wild weed populations and wild habitats and beginning to affect the food chain by killing enormous numbers of wild insects which are not pests of crops but which are the basic food for other animals, for birds. We have no idea what the ecological consequences would be. By the same token, there are enormous unknown health risks. You put a new gene into a new genetic background, yes, it may do one thing that you want, but it also will be interacting in unknown ways with other genes and other metabolic pathways, and therefore may cause new products to be produced inside the cell. Those new products could be an allergen, it could be a toxin, it could be a carcinogen. There may not be a problem, but we don't really know if it's not tested. And unfortunately, the Food and Drug Administration has required no mandatory health testing for any genetically altered foods.
An American farmer will produce a healthier grain, and an African farmer can provide better for his family, because biotechnology researchers test and test to find new solutions.
There is, I think it's a $500 million media effort on the part of the biotech companies to really enhance the profile of biotech. And I think that as with any technology, the crucial issues are who makes the decisions and who's benefiting at whose expense. And so much of what's going on in biotech is being done at the expense of indigenous peoples all over the world.
For millennia, farming families in the third world have saved seed from year to year, and farmers have always saved the seed from the best plants the previous year to use the next year. And so over generations, centuries, millennia, today's different crop species were developed by small farmers who chose the best characteristics for generation after generation.
This cocoa, my uncle planted. I replanted the small ones, you see, and married them together. This one is very, very sweet.
That's a lot of work and a lot of investment that peasant communities around the world have put into today's food supply. It wasn't until a few years ago when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that life could be patented that a new situation arose, which many people call biopiracy. That opened the door for giant biotechnology companies to take these different seed lines, these different crop varieties developed by farming communities over millennia, and patent them and say, basically from now on, if anybody uses this variety, they have to pay us for it because it's become our private property. This is called intellectual property rights by companies who say that it's their right to be able to do this because they put intellectual effort into identifying and saying what the gene sequence is. But farming families and farming communities in the third world say this is biological piracy. This is biopiracy. Our ancestors developed this, and nobody has been compensated for it.
We cannot patent life. You cannot come here and patent the West African cocoa flavor. And if you go ahead and patent the West African cocoa aroma, and it leads to a decimation of the livelihood of so many people, then we cannot be talking about the West being a partner in poverty alleviation in the developing countries. There will be another war, not a war for decolonization, but a war to free ourselves from their intellectual and scientific dominance.
If you talk to people who are working directly with the poor, you just hear story after story of how much harder life is becoming, how much harder to get access to food, to find a job that pays a living wage. The major link between globalization and increased poverty and hunger comes through the corporation. Those of us in the movements increasingly talk about corporate globalization because it is the consolidation of corporate power, the consolidation of economic activity under corporations that is the key to creating the inequality. There's lots of public relations from corporations, massive advertising telling us about how their concern is with the environment, with creating jobs, with creating prosperity for all people. But you look behind that and you read the financial pages, or you hear what corporate CEOs talk about in their own forums. And what they're talking about is that our fiduciary responsibility is to our shareholders, and it is to maximize their short-term returns. They can be fired by the shareholders if, in fact, they're not really focused on the immediate short-term bottom line, getting the stock price up. Now, then you look at the participation in stock ownership. And again, we get the message that, well, when the share prices go up, everybody benefits. But if you look at it globally, I think it's very reasonable to estimate that probably no more than 1% of the world's population has any kind of consequential ownership of shares, which means that these corporations that control so much of the economy, their function, their legal responsibility is to capture as much of the wealth as possible out of the global economy and shift it over into the bank accounts and the stock portfolios of this 1% of the population. We've created a corporate-dominated economic system that is going around, where can we find the cheapest labor to exploit? Where can we find forests that we can cut down and turn into paper chips? Where are the last remaining fish that we can send our trawlers out to harvest? The corporate system being attuned only to those financial indicators is simply not attuned to these indicators of the state of health of the planet or the state of health of society. And in fact, it is mining the living wealth of the planet, mining the living wealth of society in order to turn it into money so that the very rich can compete for a higher ranking in the Forbes list of the world's richest people.
And that's what the global trade is really about, who gets to use whose resources from all around the world. You see the decimation that kind of agenda creates for the people and the cultures. And that's another part that I think we just ignore. That's another part of the interrelatedness that I keep coming back to. We ignore, I think, what kinds of cultural losses we're suffering. We're not just suffering losses in terms of soil degradation, in terms of people from the land, in terms of water quality. We're suffering a very acute cultural loss. As we move to monocultures, I'm not talking just wheat fields now, I'm talking about monocultures in terms of urban, global, McDonald culture. As we move towards that in spades, we lose the thousands, the millions of cultural nuances and the diversity, which I think in the end is absolutely necessary for our survival as people. I'm part of an organization here in Canada, the National Farmers Union, which is part of a global peasant movement, the Via Campesina. So I have the privilege of sitting around the table with peasant leadership from many of those places in the world where the majority of the people are farming people. And everywhere the story is the same. We're no longer supposed to focus on growing food to feed ourselves and the people around us. We're supposed to grow commodities for an international trade. So then I'm in Honduras working with some farmers, and the advice to them is you have to stop growing beans and start growing chili peppers because that has an international market. It's a cash crop. That's how you get ahead. And one of the peasant leaders said, "But what will my children eat? I can't feed my children chili peppers. We have to have beans." And I'm sitting there as a Canadian farmer saying to myself, that's us. We're bigger. We grow for an export market. We're highly industrialized. And you know what else I need to tell these people? We can't make a living doing this. We're the success story on this treadmill, and we can't make a living.
In the United States, the effect of globalization has been mainly on income distribution. The median wage today is the same as it was 27 years ago. Now that one statistic, if that were a little bit more well known, we'd be having a very different debate here, because that means that literally half the labor force, and this isn't just factory workers, this is supervisors and office workers, all kinds of, half the labor force, basically, has failed to share in the gains from economic growth for over a quarter of a century. This is really unprecedented in American economic history. If you look at the period 27 years before that, from 1946 to 1973, the median wage rose about 80%. So the difference between 80% and zero is enormous. And not all of that is due to globalization and our commercial policies, but a good chunk of it is. It's impossible to say that if you're, negotiating these agreements that create all kinds of new rights and privileges for corporations to move and produce wherever it's cheapest all over the world, and nothing in there to protect labor, or the environment for that matter, it's impossible to argue that doesn't have an effect on pushing wages and living standards downward. And in fact, most economists would recognize that that has happened in the United States.
That system that you're giving to us does not work for you. How can it work for us? I've just come back from India, and you see a culture of resistance turning into a culture of decay. In 1990, the Indian government adopted the new economic policy, prescription of the World Bank and the international financial institutions. And since then, what we have seen is poverty rates are increasing. Our United Nations Population Fund did a report recently, basically saying a country like India will have to become dependent on food aid very soon. And the United Nations Population Fund blamed it on increasing population. The truth is that Indians still produce their own food. The state of Punjab, which is a fertile state, the most fertile state in India, called the granary of India, produces wheat, but most of it is used for feeding dogs and cats of Europe. The state of Haryana, which is the next fertile state, it produces tulips instead of feeding its own people. There's also the focus on growing cash crops such as sugarcane, cash crops such as cotton, which basically are, draining water from the groundwater. And these are the states which are facing drought every year. At the same time, when people do not have access to drinking water, Coca-Cola is buying up local wells in states of Maharashtra and Gujarat. So basically everything which is sacred to life, whether it's food, whether it's water, everything is being commodified. And when you meet people on the streets who are feeling the day-to-day frustration, they'll tell you what's going wrong. They know where these prescriptions are coming from. They know they're coming from the World Bank, they're coming from the IMF, they're coming from this body called World Trade Organization.
It's very hard to find any actions taken by the World Trade Organization that actually regulate trade. What they're actually regulating are governments, prohibiting governments from putting any restriction on trade that might interfere with the freedom of movement of some global corporation, working from the premise that any corporation, simply by its existence and by the fact that it controls enormous wealth, has an unalienable right to engage in business in any country, to access whatever natural resources it finds it profitable to access, and to sell whatever products it finds useful, no matter what the consequences may be for health or for the environment.
I hold the corporate system culpable. I wouldn't want to say that I hold the individuals culpable. Rather, it's a kind of economic and legal system that has allowed corporations to get too large and to have each sector of the economy dominated by only one, two, or three. It just invites collusion. It invites corrupting of politicians. It leads to good people doing bad things. Perhaps we see the most scary version of that in factory farming of animals. Farmers who want to produce hogs or who want to produce chickens today can pretty much only do it if they sign an exclusive contract with one of 3 or 4 giant companies, for example, ConAgra or one of its subsidiaries in hogs, or for example, Purdue and poultry. That contract requires that they construct at their own expense factory-like facilities where the animals are basically stacked on top of each other. When you have animals out on a pasture, a disease doesn't pass very easily from one to the other. When you have them in a high population density, highly stressed on top of each other, diseases race through the factory facility. The farmer has to continually pump the animals up with antibiotics. This creates a perfect environment to create diseases resistant to antibiotics.
They're raised in conditions which tell us only one thing, and that is that we don't view those as part of creation. We view those strictly as objects for our use and control and propagation.
So many times in the past, either out of good intentions or sometimes out of bad intentions, we have exported ways of doing things to the third world that have ended up making things worse, whether we're talking about industrial agriculture, destroying the environment, driving peasants off the land, whether we're talking about arms we've sent to the third world. I think if there's one thing we've proven is that we do not know best about what's good for other people. Many of the problems, perhaps even most of the problems in the third world, originate with institutions based right here in America. What we should do as Americans is make companies based in our country accountable, is make our government serve the interests of the majority of Americans and not the interests of a tiny group of corporations. We really don't know best, and we have to start realizing that there are strong movements in third world countries.
We have seen the farmers' movement in India, when almost 500,000 farmers marched on the streets of Delhi to demand justice, to say no to agricultural clauses in the World Trade Organization.
What is very exciting is the extent to which you're seeing solidarity developing among grassroots groups across the world, across national boundaries. This is what many of us call the globalization of civil society, which is a very positive side of globalization. But this is about people waking up, discovering their own energy, the sources of their own power, the possibilities to act cooperatively around the idea that ultimately all people in the world share the same interest in creating a society that works in balance with the planet and a society in which we live in peace with one another.
My greatest hope comes with the young people in the world, because they have the power to change the situation. And I think that as people not involved in farming come to understand the very high stakes of what's going on and the costs of the loss of small farms worldwide, that they will continue to work together and realize that what has been happening is not inevitable, and that we can make choices to create conditions that are very different. That for example, trade rules that are supporting large-scale industrial farming can be written so that they in fact support small-scale farming, or at least don't pursue their destruction. And I feel that the hope and confidence for that is rising, and partly it's because groups as diverse as farmers, nonprofit groups, what are called non-governmental groups, indigenous peoples and farm workers and trade unions and labor and environment and church and consumer movements truly around the world have all found that they have common ground on this.
I think the corporate globalization of the last couple of decades is already starting to come to an end. People are more and more finding out about this, and the global movements against this usurpation of democratic decision-making is very strong, and it's getting more and more difficult for these institutions to get away with it.
A few years ago, people would have said it's not possible to buck the trend towards free trade. I personally feel a tremendous new hope in the power of the citizenry around the world to say no. These are policies that only benefit a tiny minority of very powerful corporations and that are hurting everybody else.
A loaf of bread that cost about 94 cents. The farmer's share of that was 3.5 cents. And it cost the wheat farmer about 6.5 cents to produce the wheat that's in that loaf of bread. Now, is it any wonder that corn farmers and wheat farmers are going broke?
I think the whole conversation around food security and hunger is only a cover page and no book at all, unless you fill the script with the voices of women. That's the real story, because it's always the women who are in the gardens and in the kitchens struggling to grow food and prepare food to feed their children. We need to ask, how do women see food security, and what would they do to ensure that their children and their family have food?
Those are the kinds of questions that we need to be asking. We need to be looking at agriculture and food production as a basic necessity for life, the way we look at water that must be protected for all of us to survive.
Changing this depends as much on a spiritual awakening as a political awakening. Rediscovering that we are in fact part of the web of life of a living planet. And if there is to be any future for any of us, We have to focus on creating a cooperative global economy, not a competitive global economy, but a cooperative global economy that is geared to assuring everyone a decent means of living. Not a global economy that is geared to the competition of the strongest against the weakest. Global corporations coming down from above to suck the resources, to suck the life out of the community and turn it into money. People often ask me, do you think we'll work our way out of this? I avoid making any prediction because I don't think it's a matter of prediction. I think it's a matter of choice.